The Legend of Jimmy Spoon by Kristiana Gregory. Chapter 2, Indians. The morning air was cool. Jimmy stood in the yard behind his house, listening to his older sisters in the kitchen, clearing breakfast from the table. Mother was busy with the youngest girls, and Father had started his walk to the store, 8 streets away down Main Street. Jimmy loved this hour. The sun was still behind the dark Wasatch Mountains, and he could hear roosters crowing through the valley. He had finished raking the stable, brushing the mare, and filling the troughs with fresh water and hay. There was time to run to his favorite spot, time to enjoy being outdoors before reporting to his father at 8:30. Beyond town, a boulder with a cave-like shelter was nestled near an irrigation canal. Jimmy came here often to think and to play war with stacks of pebbles he'd flick at ants. He'd formed the Jimmy Spoon Club with the boulder as secret headquarters, but so far he was the only member. There were plenty of boys around town, but most were occupied with school this early in the morning. Because Jimmy worked in his father's store, his lessons were postponed until after supper. Jimmy listened. Had he heard someone approaching? A figure darted into the gully, and for a moment Jimmy felt a happy anticipation. Perhaps it was Robert Dean sneaking up for fun. Jimmy crouched, then inched his way around the boulder, keeping his head low and trying not to giggle. At last, a friend, he thought, smiling. But when he peeked over the side and saw who had made the noise, Jimmy froze. He was too startled to speak. 2 Shoshone boys, older than Jimmy, stood astride away. They were naked except for leather flaps around their waists and moccasins on their feet. Hair, black as crow wings, flowed over their shoulders. Each had a feather tied to the side of his head. They stared at Jimmy. Jimmy stared back. Finally, one of the Indians raised his hand in greeting. "How'd you do, white boy?" Jimmy stood still. Indians, real Indians. He'd heard stories about scalpings and such, but for some reason he didn't feel afraid. Secretly, he was delighted. He removed his hat. "Reckon I better introduce myself. Jimmy Spoon," he said, pointing to his chest. "Jimmy!" He was proud of his good manners. For several moments he watched their faces and realized that even though they seemed stern, there was no animosity. Maybe they would like to be in his club. Through gestures and a few words of English, Jimmy learned their names were Nampa, which meant moccasin, and Gamu, meaning rabbit. Nampa faced north and whistled. A brown pony with patches of white on its side appeared from the distance. Another whistle, and it trotted toward them. Jimmy drew a deep breath. The pinto was the most wonderful animal he'd ever seen. An eagle's feather was tied to her forelock, and a small beaded pouch hung from her halter. He reached tentatively to pet her jaw. Then, behind her fuzzy ear, a big brown eye watched him. "Easy, girl, easy," he said. Jimmy hugged the pony's neck and breathed in her warm smell. "Ooh-wee, she's a beaut. I wish my pa would let me have a horse like this." He looked at the boys' faces, hoping they understood him. Nampa responded by rocking his arms side to side as if cradling an infant. Then he pantomimed wearing a dress. "There's a baby?" Jimmy asked, bewildered. Gamu pointed to Jimmy, then to the pinto. He pointed north, then touched the feather in his hair. There were more gestures in broken English. Jimmy was at first confused, then he realized the boys were describing a mother, the mother of their chief. The boys wanted Jimmy to ride with them to their village, to meet this mother of their chief. Jimmy felt a small thrill. To ride a horse with real Indians would be an adventure, a wonderful adventure. While he considered this extraordinary offer, the sun's first rays burst over the top of the mountain range. Jimmy's father would be tapping his foot with impatience by now. "I gotta go, boys. I'll be back," he called over his shoulder. For the first time in days, his heart lifted at the thought of tomorrow. And that's the end of chapter 2.